What's up, guys, and welcome back to another episode of Bass Fishing Tips. And in today's video, we're going to be talking about harnessed swim baits. And you can probably tell by the smile on my face, I love throwing this bait. This is a bait that this time of year, it's a big fish catcher. It's a bite getter. And if you're willing to lock it in your hand, this is a bait that you could potentially catch the biggest bass that you will all year long on, if you just go out and you fish it. And so, yeah, before we get into all of that, though, I want to actually give one of these baits away. So if you watch my last video, the top 5 baits for the month of March, I actually said that I was going to give away a Berkeley Cull Shad. All you had to do to enter that giveaway was comment down below your favorite bait for the month of March. And the person who ended up winning that giveaway was Michael Townsend 3475. So I'm guessing your name's Michael. Michael, if you would please email me at alexroodfishing@gmail.com. I will make sure and get you your Cull Shad in the mail and to your front door so that you can go out and use the 3 tips that we're about to break down in this video to hopefully go out and catch more and bigger fish using the harnessed swim bait. So let's get into this video. Let's start by talking about what exactly is a harnessed swim bait. So a harnessed swim bait is a category of baits that really started with the mag draft. And I was throwing the mag draft back before the mag draft was even cool to throw. And it was a bait that I started to learn was extremely effective for catching not only numbers, but big bass as well. And it, you know, like I said, it's a category of baits that all kind of fall under the same umbrella, and I guess they all fall under the category, duh. But they're swim baits that are made a certain way. So as you guys can see here, this bait actually has a hook harness on the bottom, and there's actually a harness molded into the inside of this bait, and that harness is actually what holds that hook on to the bait. And that hook is attached by some split rings and some swivels, and it actually is held into the body of that bait either by some sort of magnet or some sort of clip, like you see here on the Berkeley Cull Shad. Now, what's really cool about this bait and what makes it such a deadly tool is the way that it swims and the way that it actually hooks fish. So most of these harness swim baits are weighted in the belly, and they're designed to have this awesome little head shimmy that kind of is opposite to the tail kick. So if the tail kicks to the left, the head shimmies to the right, and it just gets this awesome little shimmy back and forth, and it makes it a tool that bass cannot resist. I have noticed that if the harness swim bait that you're fishing doesn't have that particular action, it's just not as effective as other harness swim baits out there on the market. And there's a lot of companies who have tried to make harness swim baits that just didn't get that action right. But those baits with that head shimmy and that tail wag, that kind of oppositional reaction and action that bait has, those are the most effective of those style of baits. Now, the second thing is actually the hook and how the hook goes into the body of the bait and what the hook does once you hook a fish. So like you can see on this bait, this hook is actually held in the body of a Cull Shad by that little bitty clip, and that clip's going to hold that hook up in there. Now, the thing about that head shimmy, oftentimes those bass are going to hit this bait head first, meaning they're going to get that entire treble hook into their mouth. Now, once they get hooked, that treble hook actually separates away from the body of the bait, and it separates the bait and the hook apart. And so the hook will be in the fish's mouth. And the thing about it that makes it really, really awesome is this is actually attached by a swivel. And so what that means is when that bass actually comes up tail walking and slinging its head back and forth, that bait doesn't have as much leverage on that hook as other treble hook baits often do because of that swivel. And so when that bass comes up tail walking, that swivel allows that bait to freely move and keeps that hook in those fish's mouth, versus with a hard body bait, whether it's like a big glide bait or even a crankbait, that treble hook can only twist so far before it kind of hits the resistance of the body of that bait, and oftentimes that can actually kind of create a leverage point, and it can pop that hook out of those fish's mouth. And so between the action of this bait and actually how this bait hooks fish, that's what makes it so deadly and so effective, and why I love fishing this bait, especially this time of year, is because when a big fish commits to it, you want to have every advantage you can over that fish, and that hook harness is what actually is kind of the mojo, the magic, where the name of this bait actually comes from, and what makes it such an effective tool for putting big bass into the boat. Now, let's get into the 3 tips that I have for actually fishing this bait. And the first tip is actually a little modification. This is a modification that I actually learned from my good friend, Mr. Benjamin Nowak. And he did this on a jerk bait first. And then my buddy Bailey did it on his Cull shad and then shared it with me. And so I got to give credit to those guys for actually sharing this tip with me. And now I'm going to share it with you guys. And that's actually adding a target to this bait. Now, like I said, that head shimmy and that action is what's actually getting those bass to eat this thing. But sometimes, and especially this time of year, what I've noticed is these bass don't really eat it with a ton of intention. They'll oftentimes just lash out at it. I mean, it is just one of those things. It's a big profile. It's a big bait. It's disturbing a lot of water. And as this comes over this bass or near this bass just lashes out, reacts to it. And sometimes they'll hit the tail. Sometimes they'll hit the head too far up and miss the hook. And they'll just kind of blast through this bait and you won't actually get them hooked good. You know, the whole thing about this bait is actually getting them to eat it good, get that hook in their mouth, and then getting them hooked. And what Bailey noticed based off what Ben told him about the jerkbait was if you added a little bit of chartreuse to the nose section of this bait, so essentially from where the line tie is and where that hook harness starts, what Bailey was doing is he would take a chartreuse marker like this one right here, and he was just painting a little chartreuse mark right in that area right there, really kind of saturating that whole area, putting a bunch of chartreuse right there. What it did was it almost created a target for these fish. And so instead of lashing out and just blowing through the bait, they were intentionally eating it right at that head, right where that treble hook is at, and they were getting that bait in their mouth way more effectively, and he was getting way more fish to hook up versus just blasting through it. Now, when he first shared this with me, I was like, I'll be honest, that kind of sounds stupid. It doesn't really make any sense. And then I started doing it, and it was crazy how many fish I went from kind of hooking in the side of the mouth or not having a very good hook into, to these fish were completely collapsing that bait into their mouth, and they would have it in the back of their throat, and they would come up tail walking. I would be like, where is the bait? And they would have it, literally have the tail in their crushers and have the hook right in the hard part of their mouth, right where you want it. And it was just absolutely fascinating to me. Now, the more that I fished it, the more that I started to realize that that target really makes sense in kind of the nature and natural part of what these fish are already doing. Because if you look at a majority of bait fish, have, number one, big eyes. And oftentimes fish are going to eat at the eye. They're going to hit the head because they know if they hit the head, they're going to kill whatever they're actually trying to kill. And then the second thing is a lot of them had little dots or little gill plate markers, and those gill plate markers are another target for those bass. And so I think bass oftentimes are feeding on those targets because if you think about a bait fish, it's constantly moving, it's shimmying, it's doing all of these different things. Kind of like your Cull shad, that thing's constantly shimmying, it's moving. You've got two different, oppositional actions within this bait. There's a lot going on. And so if a fish can key in on something within this bait, like the chartreuse on the nose and or the eye or whatever it is, they're going to be able to eat that thing with a lot more intention and actually be able to get it in their mouth. And in the book, and I've mentioned this book before and I'll keep mentioning this book, in the book Knowing Bass, that was one thing that the book talked about, was how when bass had something they could target in on, that they would eat things with a lot more intention. And so I think adding just a little bit of chartreuse to the throat, as I like to call it, of that bait, that area between the line tie and where the hook harness actually starts, adding that little bit of chartreuse just creates that target that those bass need to actually be able to eat it well, and thus get a really good hook into those fish and get them into the boat bank or the kayak or wherever you guys happen to be fishing. Now, the second tip has to do with kind of varying the depth at which you're actually fishing this bait. So most of the time, especially this time of year, we've got bass that are moving up shallow. They're feeding up. You can focus on a lot of shallow cover, throwing this bait around shallow cover and getting those fish to react off things like laydowns, boat docks, riprap walls, those different kinds of things. Those fish will use all those areas as ambush points to actually kill bait fish and thus kill your little Cull shad when it comes swimming by them. But But what happens this time of year, and has happened actually the past couple days, hence the hoodie, I was wearing a t-shirt just a couple days ago, you'll have these cold fronts move through, and oftentimes they will push bass off of the things that they were sitting off, push them back into that little bit deeper water before that water warms up and they move back up. We actually discussed that in the best baits for March, kind of talked about how I like to have tools that when those bass do get pressured by weather changes, we've got something a little bit different to show them. But sometimes they'll still eat that coal shad. They still want that big bait, or you've already filled your limit with one of the smaller baits for the month of March, top 5 baits, and you're wanting to just lock that coal shad in your hand and try to get a big bite. What you can actually do is add weight to these baits. Now, what's really cool, and I've talked about this before, and it's going to sound like a sales pitch. I talked about this at the end of the best baits for March video, but the coal shad, for me, ultimately fixed every problem that the mag draft had. And the mag draft, like I said, was a bait that I was throwing long before it was cool to actually throw a mag draft. I was actually buying them on eBay and having them shipped into America from Japan back in the day. And one thing about the mag draft is that it has a speed in which it likes to be fished. And oftentimes, to be able to fish it at variable speeds, we were adding a ton of nail weights to that bait to get it to be able to stay upright when we wanted to fish it a little bit faster. What's really cool about the coal shad is that they fixed that problem with the way that it's actually molded. So you got a harder plastic in the body, which makes it more durable, but then they use the honeycomb design on the tail. And so as you guys can see, you still get all of that action out of that tail and get that swim that we're looking for with a little bit more denser plastic. Now, that being said, another thing that they fixed with this bait was you're actually able to add those nail weights to this bait more effectively without actually tearing up the body of the bait, because that was one thing with the mag draft, is we would add the nail weights to stabilize it a little bit more and or to fish it just a little bit deeper, what we're about to talk about, and we would just tear that bait to all to pieces. But with the coal shad, there's actually 2 designated holes on this bait where you can actually add those nail weights without tearing up the body of the bait. And so these holes are essentially sacrificial areas where you can take the nail weight and stick it into it. And so all of that being said, adding a nail weight is tip number 2. If you have fish that have moved off and or you feel as though your fish are just a little bit deeper and you need it to get just a little bit deeper, add a nail weight to this bait. Now, the secondary thing that this nail weight can do is be able to fish this bait even faster, because that's something I've seen this time of year too, that they want this bait moving a heck of a lot quicker than it is. And so not only do you need to get it deep sometimes, but you need to be able to fish it a little bit deeper and a little bit faster. And so adding a nail weight allows you to do that. Now, I'm just using like little tungsten nail weights. This is a 1/16 ounce tungsten nail weight. It is just enough weight to be able to actually get this bait to run about 1 foot to 1.5 foot deeper. And so the heavier the nail weight that you go, the deeper that you're going to be able to fish this bait effectively. Also, the heavier the nail weight that you go, the faster that you're going to be able to actually throw this bait and, you know, have it where it's one of those deals where it just helps to stabilize it a little bit. Because even with the coal shad, you know, you can really fish this bait pretty quick, but you can't burn it like you would, say, bulling a spinnerbait or something like that. But when you add some nail weight to it, it allows you to fish it at those higher speeds and to be able to just really move and groove with this bait if you need to. But it's really simple. You just take that nail weight and you actually just stick it right inside the body of that bait just like that. And like I said, there's a little sacrificial area. You can now see that nail weight stuck in there while still being able to hook that hook into the harness, have that whole thing there and not tear up the body of this bait. And so what I do normally is I'll run 2 or 3 different coal shads, and I kind of know which ones are which based on where I keep them in my box. But I'll have one with a 16th ounce nail weight, I'll have another with an 1/8, another with a 1/4, and just as I need to fish this bait deeper, or I need to fish it faster, or whatever I need to do, I can add and remove those nail weights as need be and not tear up the body of this bait, which is really, really cool. And like I said, I mean, I know it sounds a little infomercially, but the coal shad really did fix a lot of the problems that I had personally with the mag draft. And when this bait came out, it made it where the mag draft just almost became obsolete to me. And I really, really love this bait. Now, tip number 3 is going to be a unique one. And It's unique because it's something that I've discovered over the years of fishing this bait, and it really kind of started when one day I got curiosity, and I was like, I'm gonna toss this thing and I'm gonna see what happens, because this looks like Cull shad weather, it looks like Cull shad water, but it wasn't Cull shad temperature just yet, if you get what I'm saying. And I picked this bait up one day in 43-degree water and started tossing it around some laydowns and started catching some fish. And not only was I catching fish, but I was catching some big fish at that. And so tip number 3 is fish it way earlier than you think it is effective. I know a lot of you guys are just now starting to thaw out up north. I know you still got floating ice on the lakes, and I know I get the comments, I hear you guys, oh, these baits don't work because my lakes are frozen. Well, number one, I didn't choose to live where you chose to live, so that's not my fault. But number two, the end is in sight. Spring is on the way. Obviously, I'm just kidding with you guys. I love you northerners. I take 2 or 3 trips up north every year to fish. But I know a lot of you guys are dealing with ice, but right at ice out, don't be afraid to throw this bait. I think that you would be surprised what will actually happen when you throw a big bait like this, where there may not be big baits being thrown. Because one thing that I have noticed, and it's happening this year and it's happened in years past, is that sometimes fish will do things regardless of what the water temperature says we should be doing. And so like here in East Tennessee this year, we have had an extremely cold winter. We actually had ice on some of the lakes and floating ice on some of the lakes around me. And I will say this, in my life, I have never once seen a chunk of ice floating down the center of a lake, and I saw it 4 times this year. So that kind of tells you how cold that it's actually been. And what's fascinating is how these fish, even though the water is still in the low 40s and mid 40s, are starting to do springtime things that we normally don't see till the 50s and mid 50s. And I think the reason that that is happening is just because the days are getting longer. These fish have had such a cold, brutal winter that it's just time to feed. And I think that that happens every year up north. If you fish in the north, I go to Michigan, I go to New York every single year and I fish, and it always amazes me that when it's time to do something, the fish do it. And I think it's because they know instinctually in their little brains that their window of time is way shorter than the rest of the country. I don't think they obviously rationalize that there's other fish in other parts of the country, but what I'm saying is in their lives, their window's shorter, period. And so because their window's so much shorter, they got to get to business. They got to eat, they got to spawn, they got to eat again after the spawn, and then it's time for fall again, and then it's winter and there's ice over their head. And so I think that regardless of what the temperature is telling us to do, the water temperature is telling us to do, that throwing baits that shouldn't quote unquote work in certain water temperatures can be one of the most effective tools for actually catching bass on. And that's exactly what the Cull shad has done. Every single year, I start to throw it a little bit earlier. And every single year, I still catch fish on this thing. And it amazes me how fish that, again, regardless of what the water temperature says they should be doing, will eat this bait. And so don't be afraid to throw it in cold water. Don't be afraid to throw it early. Don't be afraid to throw it at ice out, because you'll be amazed what happens when you throw this thing, when you toss this thing around, and some of the bass that will come completely unglued on this thing, because that's what happens this time of year in that early water that I've noticed, that you may get a bunch of followers, but when one finally decides that it's going to eat it, it eats it with intention and it eats it with aggression that I have not seen bass eat many other things with, and you will be digging this thing out of the back of their throat, and it is freaking awesome. And so yeah, go out, fish the harness swim bait. Go pick up a Cull shad, go pick you up a mag draft, go pick you up whatever brand that you want. Go check it out, go fish it. I'll make sure to link everything that I use down below so that you guys can go check it out, including size, colors, and brand. And yeah, if you enjoyed this, make sure and click this video that's popping up right here.